Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. Today I want to talk to you about 5 things that Christians tell themselves to convince themselves that they are not part of the LGBTQIA community, or as we're taught to say in church world, that they're not experiencing same-sex attraction, which, as I said before, has become a bit of a dog whistle for negative ways to phrase being part of the LGBTQIA community. As most of you know, I spent a lot of my time within church community as a child, as a youth, and then again in my profession for a long time. So some of this is from my own experience, and some of this is, well, a lot of this from my own experience, but also these are pretty widespread. In no particular order of importance, here are those 5 things. Number 1, this is a choice. So as we've heard so many people say, you are choosing to be attracted to someone who is not your natural attraction, right? So since it is a choice to be queer, then obviously you can make the choice to be straight, which is what so many people are then convinced to do. If they're experiencing these thoughts and desires towards someone of the same sex, they convince themselves they just need to try really hard to choose to be attracted to a member of the opposite sex. And then they'll be happy, and then they'll be within God's plan for their life or whatever, and then they won't be upset anymore. Logically makes sense if attraction was a choice, but it's not, and that's where the problem is. Historically, the understanding that being part of the queer community is a choice made sense at one point because so many people were so steeped in heteronormativity that they couldn't understand how somebody wasn't just like them. And so if they just sort of like were born and grew up and were straight and other people weren't, it only made sense for other people to not be straight if they chose to not be. And as we've talked about here on the channel, historically, there was a philosopher who came up with this idea of ABA and also conversion therapy. When he put people through conversion therapy, they came out straight, which means they could then choose to be straight. This idea became what a lot of people believed. Now, we know now that less than 1 in 100 people who go into any kind of therapy to change their orientation stick with that change. Less than 1 in 100. Basically nobody. There is still, for some reason, this overarching idea that you can choose who you are attracted to and you can choose what that means. Ironically, this idea comes from the very same people who also say that men can't choose to just look away from women's bodies if women's bodies aren't covered up. Haven't figured that one out yet, how that works, but that's where we are. Number 2, you're giving into worldly desires. Because things like desire and sex and sexuality and, well, all things sexual in general come from the world and not from God, and because anything to do with being any part of the LGBTQIA community is only about sex, according to this community, then being part of the queer community means that you are focusing on sexual things and therefore giving in to what the world has and what the world expects of you. So their answer then is get off of social media because gay people are everywhere in social media, and only pay attention to the things that are within your church or within your sphere of influence and only the good things that are in your life, right? Surround yourself with accountability partners or people who are going to keep you on that narrow, good path because the world wants to pull you down. This idea that there's this all-encompassing plan to derail Christians from their path to God is what people are taught from the very beginning. And the only way to not get derailed is to divest yourself of all worldly things and all worldly influences. And the more you are influenced by the world, the more susceptible you are to the world's messages. And because so many Christians believe that the world is the gayest it's ever been or whatever, that clearly is what is influencing someone's feelings when they start to think they might be queer. Number 3, this is something that is said, interestingly enough, in some more accepting, open, and liberal church entities. If you are gay, that's okay. You just can't act on it. This is an interesting way to gaslight yourself, right? You can have the feelings you have all the feelings that you have, because that's fair and you can't help your feelings. We can all agree on that one, except you can't act on any of them because your desires are still not okay when they become action. Essentially, that's the same thing as like original sin. Like, we all are born with original sin in us, but acting out on that sin is the problem. This idea of like, you can't help who you are and we accept you as you are, but we expect you to not be living into a sinful life, so you can't act on it. Hugely problematic and damaging in some ways that you don't see for years and years to come, because the understanding that the action is the problem doesn't take root until you are in a situation where you would take action, right? So even after you've left the church and even after you've started to self-actualize and understand who you are and be okay with who you are and be okay with what that means, it's not until you are actually taking action that that comes up again, and you have to face what you've been taught and how to let that go. Number 4, I don't have enough faith, or this is a test. So you grow up in the church thinking that so many things, so many parts of your life are a test of your faith. And you grow up like this because everybody who has been in the church has heard the story of Jesus being taken to the desert to be tempted and have his faith tested. You hear about Abraham having to potentially sacrifice his son that he's wanted for so long in order to be faithful to God. There are so many stories that you hear from a very young age of people having to give up the things that they care about the most in order to show their allegiance to God. And all of these great people of faith are being tested. So why wouldn't you be tested, right? If someone's trying to make sense of their attraction or their confusion and they talk to someone like within their church community about it, the answers they're given are pray harder, pray more, spend more time in scripture, memorize scripture, focus every minute that you're thinking about this other stuff and this time that you're trying to figure out who you are, and focus it on the pieces of religion that keep you locked in. And in reality, all that does is create religious OCD, where your compulsion when you have any thoughts to do with anything in this genre then is to go to prayer, to go to scripture. And that will continue to come up in your mind long after you've left the church. Those thoughts of, I am dirty, I am bad, I need to be punished, I need to go do something ritualistic like pray, I need to go fill my time with something that is habitual and repetitive. That is a thought that still is going to need to be filled if you don't do some work to untangle that, because you've connected the two in your brain, and that stays connected until you disconnect them. Displacing something that is a repetitive thought for you with a different repetitive action is not doing the work to help yourself with something. That does nothing but make the problem harder. And the last one, possibly one of my favorites, is the devil is tempting me. Because who are we if we cannot blame our problems on the devil? God forbid we take any responsibility for anything going on in our own minds or in our own bodies. This one gets sold as like, Jesus got tempted, and so if the Son of God got tempted, of course you get tempted too, right? Like, who are you to not be tempted? And the response here is, when the devil's tempting you, you should be reminding yourself of all of the great things that God has in store for you when you follow his plan. Thinly veiled, this is not his plan. Being queer is not his plan. Can't possibly be. If you follow his plan, he will have someone of the opposite sex ready for you that will make your life wonderful and beautiful and within the expectations of the world, so you can continue to follow the paths that we have all chosen for you and do what we expect of you. This is yet another example of how individual thought is just not welcome here. You having a feeling or a thought or a concern cannot just be maybe who you are. It can't be something coming from inside of you. The fear that comes up in someone's mind when they think about whether or not they might be part of the LGBTQIA plus community, especially if they are part of a Christian organization or family, is very real. It can be very scary to think about whether or not they might not be who their family has expected them to be all along, or who they've expected themselves to be all along. And instead of addressing that fear and figuring out what that means and working on how to rewrite their own story to be more in line with who they've discovered themselves to be, they're told to like pull that out, blame it on this abstract devil character over here, and then continue on the path that's already been written for them. That's so harmful to people because they're not encouraged to be themselves. They're not encouraged to think for themselves, and they're not encouraged to honor who they actually are, because who they are might not match who everyone else has expected them to be. When your focus on who you are is in relation to who everyone else has expected you to be, that's going to lead to some problems for you, because shoving down who you are in favor of who everyone else wants you to be means you don't get to know who you are. And at some point that comes back up. So there you go. There are 5 ways that Christians gaslight themselves into thinking they are definitely not part of the LGBTQIA+ community. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other.